Season's greetings and welcome to Look What You Learned, the jolliest channel this side of the nut house. I'm one of the old god's unholy mistakes, but you can call me Jack. Learners, it's December, a time of cold weather and holiday cheer. For me, it has another point of significance, as the time of year when I usually find myself watching a show that I think is my favorite, that being The Magicians. If you haven't seen this show, then let me tell you, it's got everything. Magic, interesting fantasy worlds, a fun cast of characters that are all stupidly hot, unique comedy, gut-wrenching drama, a bunch of actors you've seen in other stuff, and while it isn't the main focus of the show, it does have a few fights. Now, whenever there's a story with both magic and combat, I always want to see people use magic to fight, and The Magicians delivers here, having a list of spells that are specifically meant for battle. It's not a long list, mind you, because, again, action isn't the main focus of the show, but still, I like the show's battle magic, and I've wanted to make an official list for a while. And since I'm already rewatching the show, I thought, why not finally do it? And so I did, and here it is. If you're not familiar with the show, spells in The Magicians are performed with a combination of words and tuts, which are these fancy hand movements. They're fueled by magic, which is a kind of energy that comes from a wellspring in another dimension and flows through the universe. If the magic gets turned off, then humans can't cast spells unless they find an alternative source, like grinding up magical creatures into a snortable powder. Okay, before I get to the list, I have some ground rules. There's a lot of spells in the show that could be used for combat, like the 3 or 4 different fire starter spells, or wards, or Julia's weird light beam things. Lots of stuff like that. For the purposes of this video, I'm only including spells that are specifically meant for combat. Also, I'm only including spells used by human magicians. We see a lot of various attacks from gods and fairies and such, but these aren't really spells, they're just ways that they can use their innate magical power. Also, I'm not including some of the spells we see used by the Beast, since he needs to have 6 fingers on each hand to cast them. Okay, let's finally get to the list. The first real battle magic we see in the series is a spell that I call the Fog Blast. It's cast by Dean Fogg in the very first episode as he burst into the lab to try and fend off the Beast. The spell causes a series of sigils to appear and form a kind of energy blob in midair, which then gets launched at the target. The only tuts we see involve moving the hands up the side of the caster's body, holding them out in front of the chest, then pushing out towards the target, though Fogg seems like he's in the middle of casting it when he bursts into the room, so there's probably at least a few more steps that we didn't see. The attack does push Martin back a little bit, but he recovers pretty quickly and ultimately doesn't seem to be hurt all that bad, which is a shame because I personally think this is probably one of the most powerful direct attacks the Dean has in his arsenal. I mean, I can't prove it, since we never see it again, but come on, he's confronting the Beast directly, and after 40 timelines, you'd hope he'd come in with the big guns. It's possible that the low damage is because Martin is powered up by the wellspring, and it's also possible that Fogg never uses it again because he's never in a situation where he really needs serious firepower, but that's just a few guesses on my part. The next spell of interest is actually the most commonly used battle magic spell in the show, the Force Push. It sends out a wave of kinetic energy that sends anyone it hits flying backwards. Honestly, it's one of the least deadly battle magic spells, which is probably why it's used so often. That also might be because the tuts for it are really quick and simple, which is important for self-defense. We first see this in Season 1, Episode 2, when Katie uses it to try and fend off the Beast. It doesn't do much damage there, but when we see it later reflected back in Quentin, he's sent flying with so much force that he breaks his arm, though that happens because of his landing rather than the blast itself. Despite how prominent this spell is, there really isn't much more to say about it. It's just a quick, non-lethal spell that's good in a pinch. Next is another quick one-off spell without a formal name, though this one is actually super deadly. In Season 1, Episode 8, Elliot uses a quick spell against Mike, who's possessed by the Beast, causing his neck to snap. We see a few different spells with neck snapping or general telekinetic effects in the show, but this one stands out to me for a couple reasons. It's a one-handed spell, which isn't super common, and as Elliot casts it, the tip of his fingers glow red, which is kinda cool. Elliot also later comments that using this spell was easy, but it's possible that he meant in the moment, since he was feeling so much emotion, which fuels spells in general. Next is a super hot spell that, while technically unnamed, I think is pretty safe to call the Fireball. Because, well, that's what it makes, a ball of fire that ignites its target on contact. We first see this spell in Season 1, Episode 10, when the Netherland magician Eve shoots one at Penny. As far as I know, we never see anyone actually hit with this spell, but based on how it ignites a stone pillar on fire, I'm assuming it's pretty dangerous. It's another one-handed spell that's also pretty simple to cast in terms of hand movements. I'm pretty sure that we see variations of this spell cast a couple times in the series, though I'm not 100%. I think Martin shoots a powered-up version at Alice during their fight in Season 2, and in Season 3 I think this is the spell that Harriet casts to show Katie what the fairy powder does, though again, not completely sure. The next 4 spells are introduced in Season 1, Episode 11, and are all learned from the Japanese Battle Magic Manual. The first one I'll cover is a one-off that I don't think we ever see used in battle. I call it the Flame Bolt, because it has a very similar effect to the Fireball spell I just covered. Both shoot out a projectile that lights things on fire, though this one requires 2 hands to cast, and has a more complicated series of tuts. Next we have another prominent battle spell called Magic Missile. Well, I guess technically it's called
Magikuru Misaidu.
But translated. This is the second most commonly used battle spell in the show, though unlike Force Push, this spell doesn't have a super good track record in terms of being helpful in battle. It looks cool though, as it shoots out a little dagger-like bolt of explosive energy. Don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily a useless spell, it's just that the only times it successfully hits an opponent, Martin Chatwin and a Taker, they really aren't that hurt. Still, it's useful for blowing up objects like doors and magic bottles. We actually see a few variations of this spell throughout the series. First, in Season 2, Alice casts a version that shoots out multiple beams instead of just one. In Season 4, we see Margot cast Magic Missile using a completely different hand movement that's much quicker and simpler. I'm guessing that that's just due to an error in the visual effects, but hey, maybe she streamlined the casting for some reason. Later in Season 4, we see one of the head librarians shoot out a version that looks more like a blue fireball. The sister catches this attack and throws it back at him, reducing him to ash, though it's not entirely clear if he powered up the spell or if the sister did. After that, we have another quick one-handed spell that I assert is the quickest and easiest spell in the entire series to cast. I call it the Slasher, because, well, it slashes things. If you wanted to get more clever, you could call it the Invisible Dagger or something, but I prefer the Slasher, so there. The basic version of the spell sends out a wave of energy or something that slices open anything it hits. It's technically a projectile, but it seems like it's meant to be used at much closer range than something like Magic Missile. When Penny uses it against Eve, it hits her from about a meter away and leaves a pretty gnarly gash that puts her down seconds later. Martin is able to cast a version that travels much further and almost takes Quentin's arm off. Like I said, this is potentially the simplest spell to cast, since it requires 1 or 2 simple tuts performed in quick succession with one hand. Here's the first, and I think only defensive spell on this list. I call it the Barrier, because it creates a transparent shield that can block incoming attacks. I don't call it the Shield because there's already a very similar spell called the Sumerian Shield Charm that also creates a transparent wall in front of the caster. It's not really clear what differentiates the two, other than their tuts and some of the visual effects, but I think that the Sumerian Shield is weaker and remains in place for a bit after it's cast, while the Barrier is stronger and disappears once the magician drops their hands. Exactly how strong the Barrier is a little unclear, but we do know that it's able to block the Flame Bolt spell. Usually the Barrier appears right in front of the caster, though in Season 3, Julia makes one appear in front of Alice, who's a little ways away. She is using fairy powder when she does this, though, so maybe that has something to do with it. Later in the season, we see Harriet cast a different spell that actually shatters a barrier put up by her mom, which is kind of interesting. You don't see that very often. Also, throughout the show, there are other forms of shields and barriers that can be used for defense, but this is the only one that's used specifically for battle. Alright, here comes the big guns. Well, big gun, the BFG if you will. The Rhinoman Ultra is one of, if not the most powerful battle magic spell available to human magicians, at least in terms of raw destructive power. It creates a series of glowing shapes that come together to create one big shape that then shoots out and disintegrates anything within a 20-foot radius of a hit. Allegedly. That's what it's supposed to do, though both times we see it used, it doesn't quite play out that way. It's first seen in Season 2, Episode 2, then in the next episode we actually see Alice hit the beast with it. It's not quite a dead-on hit, and while it doesn't disintegrate him, it does char half of his body and leave him with only one working arm. In Season 3, we see Julia use it against the beast from Timeline 23, and all it does is kill the moths in front of his face. A bit of a letdown, but to be fair, both beasts are supercharged with magical energy, so I guess it's believable that they could tank such a powerful hit. Now, you might be wondering why such a powerful spell only gets used a couple of times, and the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, the spell uses so much power that normal humans usually need to get a boost from a god in order to cast it without burning up. It's unclear if a human could ever become naturally powerful enough to use it unaided, but we never see this, nor is it implied. It is supposedly possible for two normal magicians to cast it with cooperative casting, though the one and only attempt with that ends with one participant exploding, so pretty dangerous even if it is possible. The second reason the spell isn't used regularly is because it's pretty complicated. Not only are there a good amount of tuts, there also seems to be something supernaturally complicated about it, as Alice claims there's a lot of moving parts. This could mean that the caster has to somehow focus on the different shapes as they come together, kind of like an internal circumstance. Or it could also mean that each part materializes, it draws more energy from the caster. Or it could mean something else, I don't have all the answers. Whatever the case, it's a powerful yet complicated spell that can theoretically wipe out anything short of a god if you have the skills to use it. But what if you do need to kill a god? Fortunately, there's a spell for that, which can be found in the book The Ars Decidium, aka The Art of Killing Gods. This unnamed spell, first seen in Season 2, lets you enchant a metal object with god-killing power, though you only get one use out of it since the spell dissipates afterwards. All you need to do is a few tuts and a little incantation. Well, that and you need a lot of power. In fact, this spell requires so much energy, the only thing shown capable of powering it is the divine life energy of a god or demigod. So if you're a normal human, you kinda need to kill a god to power the god-killing spell. That or find one that's already dying, but since gods aren't really meant to die, that's not gonna happen very often. Also, if you do kill a god, their old god parents will shut off magic, so there's that. Also, it doesn't work against the twin mistakes. It'll just kill the person they're possessing. R.I.P. Charlton. So yeah, there's a few limitations, but hey, at least deicide is possible, I guess. Next we have a spell that I really debated even putting on the list, but ultimately it's important to the show and can only be used for combat, so what the heck. The Swordmaster spell can turn anyone who uses it into a master swordsman, even if they've never held a sword before. We see this in Season 2, Episode 9, when Elliot, a complete sword-fighting noob, is able to go toe-to-toe with King Idri, a warrior king and undefeated duelist. This is one of the few spells that uses only an incantation with no tuts, but it does require another important thing. See, you can't use just any sword. The spell comes from and is channeled through a very specific sword. Also, if you get disarmed or there's a fluctuation in the flow of magic, then you gotta redo the incantation. And if you don't have any sword skills without the spell, then that puts you in a very dangerous position. Next is a kind of weird spell that I call the Telekinetic Toolbox. Basically, after an initial series of tuts, the user is able to cause different telekinetic effects by performing certain gestures. These effects include lifting people in the air, flinging them around, and choking them. It's quick, versatile, and as we first see in Season 3, it can be used against multiple people at the same time, though it's worth noting in that instance it's being fueled by fairy powder. Later, in Season 4, Episode 11, Dean Fogg uses what I think is the same spell. It does similar things, and he uses the same choking gesture at least. When he does it, he gets these glowing rings around his arms, which I think indicate that the spell is active. I don't know, you could argue that this one isn't battle magic, but the only times we see it, it's used to fight people, so I put it on the list. The last entry on this list is one that most likely is either multiple spells or not a spell at all. Throughout the series, several characters, though mostly Alice, will send out these waves of force that fling people around. It's very similar to the Force Push, except that it's done one-handed. Like I said, it's mostly Alice doing it, and each time she does, she's powered up in one way or another, leading me to believe that this technique exists on the fringe of spellcasting, and might be more of a raw release of magical energy. The god Ember does something very similar in the Season 2 finale, which I think supports my claim. Oakley dokley, learnerinos. That's it for this video and this year. I hope you liked it. The Magicians is a really fun show, you should totally check it out if you haven't. Fair warning though, it does have a lot of sexual content, which A-okay with me, but might put some people off. Also, I'm pretty sure someone working on it really didn't like cats. Give it a shot, see for yourself. While you're at it, do the usual YouTube stuff to support my channel. It's been a great year, and here's hoping that 2023 is even better. I'll see you then, but for now, look what you learned.